Welcome, everyone. This is the weekly chat with your 3 Brattleboro State Representatives and whatever lovely community members decide to join us here in our Zoom squares. We've been meeting every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. for the last couple months to talk about whatever's going on in the legislature, new happenings with regards to the pandemic and its effects and impacts, opportunities on the horizon. This is going to be our last sort of open forum conversation, and after that we're going to start doing legislative updates and then moving into specific topics. So this week we're going to be talking about whatever people bring to the room, and next week we're going to try focusing just on opiates. So if people have suggestions for specific topics they'd like us to cover, please feel free to get in touch via email or phone call. We're all very easy to find via the Google or whatever other way you like to get information. And on that note, I think we should get started. Mollie or Tristan, do you one of you want to start with updates?
Go ahead, Mollie. If you're ready to do so.
All right. I said you always make me go first. Anyway, so in my, I'll just give a little update on my committee. The committee work that I'm doing right now is pretty sort of very nitpicky motor vehicle land. It's a miscellaneous motor vehicle bill that's moving through our committee that passed the Senate. And it's got a lot of little things in it related to little things that the agency, the Department of Motor Vehicles needs to have fixed, like weight limits on trucks and just all these little things that aren't particularly interesting to the general public. The thing about that bill is it did pass the Senate on second reading before March 13th. And that bill on third reading, Senator Ashe was going to bring an amendment to that bill around, I'm not sure how it was going to be worded, but having to do with having the state enter into the Transportation Climate Initiative Compact. And that bill got stalled. And now what's stalled is the whole transportation, I don't know if anybody's following that, but the Transportation Climate Initiative. So that was sort of the exciting thing about that bill, and it's not happening right now. So there was a couple of issues. One issue that we need to try to resolve around kids who are in driver's ed right now and the only thing that's holding them back from getting their licenses is 6 hours of driving when they're instructor, and they can't get that. And the Secretary of Education is sort of dragging his feet on this. So that's something that I'm trying to resolve. And I have a lot of
curiosity about that one when you do resolve it, Mollie, from a very personal, non-legislative perspective.
Well,
I hope you can fix it.
Yeah, well, it's I'm hearing about it from our grandson. So I told him he needed to write a letter, and anyway, so get him involved. So that's sort of, and then the transportation bill just passed the House. I think it was unanimous. And usually it's not too controversial. We did have some climate related things in there that had to be sort of put in as intentional. If we're hoping that there will be an infrastructure bill coming from the federal government, hoping, and that would mean that we could sort of use a lot of that to spend on our climate priorities like electric vehicle incentive program. We had to sort of just keep that going with the money that we had from this year. And so it was a good process in that it was a very collaborative kind of consensus bill in our committee, which is a mixed committee as they all are in terms of parties. But one of the things that is in that bill is that right now public transit is fare free because of the CARES Act, put in a lot of money into public transit, $20 million, which is helping to keep them going, keep them afloat when they're not getting so much money and able to clean the buses. And so that's still there. And there's also, we did add $500,000 to implement the recommendations of a public transit study that we had recommended last year. And those are things like, local and regional, improving local and regional service, using more technology, access, marketing, etc., things like that. So we were able to sort of squeeze that in, even though that wasn't in the agency recommendation. We also were able to put in $100,000 to the Downtown Transportation Fund, which had been slashed in half in 2009, and we kept trying to put more money back into it. And it's money that towns can use, like with a half-town match, to do little transportation improvements that might not go with a project. Like if you wanted to put things that will enhance a downtown, it could be used, say, for a bike shelter or plantings or outdoor amenities or little things like that. The grants are not huge, but it's a really important program that's done in conjunction with the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, specifically for the 23 designated downtowns in the state. And it's a grant. And I think that Brattleboro might be interested in applying for that for the bike shelter. I've been talking about that with the group I'm involved with, the Brattleboro Coalition for Active Transport. Let's see, what else? Oh, one other thing. Well, two other things. One is that I've been involved with some conversations about the migrant community, the migrant worker community, and there's some legislation or proposal, I'm not sure what it is at this point in the Senate, because those people, undocumented workers who work on dairy farms and keep our dairy industry alive, are not able to get the $1,200 federal stimulus. So there's a proposal to use state money to give them a $500 benefit. I was on a group call the other day, sort of talking about their healthcare needs are pretty taken care of, but the issue is sort of the economic impact for them, and also housing, because many of these workers live in congregate housing and can't really practice social distancing. And so it's just a lot of problems related to that. There's a group called Migrant Justice, which you may have heard of, that works directly with the undocumented people. But then the question is, do you just deal with the farm workers, or do you consider all undocumented people who might be working in construction or restaurants or things like that? So that's just sort of an ongoing discussion, and it sort of leads into discussions in the Women's Caucus, which are really overlapping with discussions in the Workers' Caucus about the impact of COVID, particularly on women, low-income women, and particularly on low-income people. And it sort of feeds into the Social Equity Caucus. So there's just all these issues, these overlapping issues. We have these three of others. You know, we have a Climate Caucus, we have a Workers' Caucus, we have a Women's Caucus, we have a Social Equity Caucus, we have a Rural Economic Development Caucus. A lot of these issues are blending together, and trying to figure out how to sort of push to allocate a lot of the CARES money into places where it's going to be really useful. So I think I'll just stop there, and happy to answer questions.
We'll hold the questions, I think, after
I meant later. Yeah.
But definitely, if you have questions that you think you're going to forget, throw it in the chat, and we'll come back to it. And if if you're confident of your ability to remember, then you can just wait. And we'll do three. The three of us will do these quick updates, and then we open it up, and then the next week we'll be doing the theme. My updates are, I think, fairly brief. I discussed last week that the governor had given us a PowerPoint presentation on his economic development agenda. And this week we started to see the language in the House Commerce and Economic Development Committee of the legal language that would underpin the ideas that were presented on that slide deck. And we've now done a few hours of just understanding the basic mechanisms of what they're proposing and some of the challenges around what is clear and what is not clear. The federal government is issuing guidance that keeps getting updated as people, they sort of react to the lack of clarity at the state's level from all over the country of how to use the money. One thing that happened this week that sort of alters one aspect of the work is that the Senate had put forward a bill, 346, that was a hazard pay bill And they felt very strongly that the way that they had constructed it was completely consistent with the use of the money that the federal government had put into Vermont and other states. The House was not as confident of that. We were interested in wanting to think through who needs hazard pay, or what would that do, particularly around sort of the equity issues of where the lines are drawn and what level of risk before you get it, and all of those kinds of questions. And we were concerned about the federal guidance seeming to us to be clear that they wouldn't necessarily allow us to spend the money as widely as the Senate had said. And actually, on Thursday, the federal government released new guidance, and in fact, they clarified that a lot of the uses of the structure that the Senate had put in place is actually not allowed. And so they have allowed for payroll expenses for public safety, public health, healthcare, human services, and similar employees whose services are substantially dedicated to mitigating and responding to the COVID public health emergency. So basically, they limited hazard pay to public health delivery, people who are employed in the delivery of public health, in specifically to public health as it relates to COVID. So, if you're working on other issues and you're not at risk, then you wouldn't be eligible. So it's a much narrower set of eligibility. And so what we've got going on in committee is we've got this dynamic of wanting to think about the equity, the vulnerability that employees and employers are experiencing. I'll say it again because there are some new folks here, that the restaurant industry, the craft brewing industry, certainly retail industries, but especially the restaurant industry, hospitality industry as a whole, are very, very vulnerable right now. And that the governor, in his proposal, recognized that and put a pretty substantial bucket of money in place for them. And we are highly motivated to do our work as quickly as possible to get that money into their hands, while also not simply rubber stamping the decisions of the governor, because we think that there is an opportunity or need to think about the employees in this system, and have a sort of a balance of our response to both employee needs and employer needs within this framework. So we are trying to explore that in our House committee work, and we'll see how it goes. This coming week, if you're interested in this topic, the agenda will be posted probably on Monday on the House Committee, Commerce and Economic Development Committee website, and that agenda will tell you when we're meeting, and then when we meet, there's a live YouTube link, and so you can watch the testimony and the deliberations and see how that starts to unfold as we grapple with the actual details here. So I think that's been the big piece for me in my committee work, and frankly, like, that kind of work is happening in several committees of jurisdiction as we try to figure out how to move some of the 1.25 billion that came in for COVID response, how we look to move that out into the Vermont economy with intention, but also speed.
Thanks. So I'm towards what Mollie and Tristan both ended with. I'm doing some, I think, good hustle over the weekend with the Workers' Caucus and the Women's Caucus to put some outlines on a proposal for the Commerce Committee and for the other committees to really see how we can use this funding that's going to small and medium businesses to really help them transition to be businesses that are good places to work and that are really meeting the needs of women and workers who are women and workers who aren't women, but really knowing that policies that are good for folks who are operating at the bottom of our economic base and really holding the economy together are often low-income women. And so policies that work for women are policies that work for everyone and really help build resilient communities and families and schools even. And so really excited about the coalition we've been able to pull together, and that we have such an awesome 3-person team here in Brattleboro who can all be on the same page about something. And Spoon, we can hear you. So if you want us to hear you, you should speak louder. And if you don't want us to hear you, you should mute yourself.
And can you hear me?
I can hear you. If you would like, I should give a new tour. So we are taking questions at the end.
Well,
And so
I was going to say, you can see me if you open my video.
if
Because
you,
I have a video. It just has to be open from your end.
Tristan's gonna chat with you in the chat box about the technical details of that.
Okay.
I'm going with my presentation. And then if anyone would like to ask a question at the end, we're gonna raise our little blue hands that we can find in the participant box. And I'll take people through that again because some more people have joined us since the technology tour. So that's what's happening on that front. Sort of other pieces of the COVID money that are, I think, really important to me and to us and to our area are Brattleboro and actually the whole state of Vermont really solved homelessness for a brief couple months there, and really excited about some proposals on the table to sustain that solution, which in this area might look like some of our homeless services organizations and housing services organizations being able to buy a motel possibly in order to really have people have much more sustainable transitional living situation, and then slowly, you know, move into new building. And if people want to learn more about that, this week's Montpelier Happy Hour, which is on BCTV and on my Facebook page, Olga and I interviewed Maura Collins from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency to talk more about all of that. And then on food security, there's some exciting proposals floating around about how we can really grow and sustain our food security system, both school meals that have been delivered to each Vermonter's house, each Brattleboro person's house over this pandemic, what that will look like for summer, because summer meals are so much more complicated and haphazard often, how we might be able to sustain that through the year, and then also how our existing other food systems, whether that's food shelves, or congregate meal sites, can really collaborate possibly with restaurants, collaborate with farmers who are struggling, to really use this as an opportunity to take the farm to plate movement to the people is, I think, a nice way to think about it. And so there's some exciting movement on that. And I think we as a Windham County delegation are going to talk a little more about that on Tuesday morning and can tell you more about that after that. In committee, we passed out on the House floor the yield bill this year, which is sort of complicated and fairly boring in the weeds. But the summary of it is that essentially the way we usually close the gap in the education fund is by saying how much money do we need after we take all the other sources of revenue to cover all the school budgets that have been voted. And then we divide that up amongst property taxpayers with a lot of adjustments in there. That is not what we did this year. This year we said, yes, that just passed the House. It has not gone over to the Senate yet. It's on its way to the Senate. This year we said the challenges with the Ed Fund are COVID related, and so we don't want to just default them onto the taxpayers because they are not necessarily property tax. They're not the responsibility of property taxpayers. They need to be solved a different way. And so we set the yield at the rates that we are anticipating in January, which is a very slight increase from last year for a sort of cost of living and things like that, and are looking to fill the gap in the Ed Fund in a variety of other ways, some of them through federal money and some of them perhaps through other sources of revenue and or taxes. But really wanted to make sure that communities knew that property taxes are not about to see a huge spike because of COVID, and that we are really interested in continuing to fully fund our public education systems, especially in this time when we know that kids and families and teachers need us now more than ever. And then the bill that was floating through the building about Brattleboro's municipal budget and Brattleboro's municipal budget only, because we were the only town that did not yet have an approved budget, has went through the House and was voted out of the Senate this week, and is on the governor's desk. And so that's really exciting, because now the Brattleboro town can have a budget and set some tax rates. I think I mentioned that last week. Two more things. One, have been working with Rich Bolshook, who is a Brattleboro community member, and I believe Mollie or Tristan's constituent, not mine, on a bill around hunting and fishing licenses for Abenaki folks, to provide free hunting and fishing licenses to folks who are members of a recognized Vermont tribe and recognized by the state of Vermont. But that could be folks who might live, on the borders of Vermont, or what was once part of Abenaki land use. And so that has been voted out of my committee and voted out of the House Natural Resources Committee, and is going to be on the floor sometime soon. It's fairly controversial in the way that anything related to identity becomes controversial in a party system these days. And so that's going to be an interesting conversation next week if we can pick it up. And last thing I want to say is that this country's in a really difficult place right now. And I think we're facing some issues around race and how we deal with race and police brutality and the role of police and all of our bias, both explicit and implicit. And as so many cities are really embroiled in fighting that issue very directly, it's hard to know what to do in Vermont. Because I think some of us think that we're beyond it, and some of us think that we're in the middle of it, and some of us don't really know. And I think all of those things can be true. And so we can do something for folks in the specific affected communities that we're hearing about in the news.
Sorry, I'm pulling you away from whatever this is. Oh, it's a sort of town meeting.
And then we can also really look at what the work that we need to do in Vermont. And there's a lot of organizations in Vermont that are doing really good racial justice work. We have Black Lives Matter chapters. We have Standing Up for Racial Justice chapters. We have the Community Equity Collaborative here in Brattleboro that does really good work. And we've done a lot of really pretty incredible work with the state police around implicit bias, and continue to do that work. And we're doing some pretty good work around making sure that we have appropriate data around racial equity as related to COVID. But there's still a lot more to do, and there's a lot more to do in our communities on that work. And just want to say that I am committed to continuing to do that work, both in the legislature around use of force legislation, as well as a number of other issues. On that, I'm going to stop talking.
So I'm going to do a couple things. I want to add something to what you just said, but I also wanted to help make sure that Spoon, I muted you because there was background noise. And I had just checked in with Spoon privately on the tech question, and you've posted a couple comments that I suspect that you want to respond to the whole group so that everyone can see, but have come to me, and I will try to bring those into the space in just a second. And I know Michael has his hand up. I assume that that's for the question period, and we'll definitely catch you, Michael. And Bob threw a question in as well. And so I've got all of that captured, including Spoon, your comments, and we'll make sure we bring them all in into the different threads. The piece I wanted to add to what Emilie offered around the education fund is that how to say this, there's a very strong likelihood that this is going to be a repeat of 2 of the last 3 years of the interactions between the legislature and the governor around the cost of the education system. And the yield bill, what Emily was describing, what we have done is say we respect the votes that happened at local levels. There is a separate issue, and it's going to come. We're going to circle back to it because Bob asked the question about Brattleboro. There is a separate question about 18 or 19 districts that don't have budgets yet. But for the vast majority of schools in the state, they have passed their budgets, and our approach respects the local decision-making component of our education system and says we'll figure out how we'll fund depending on the complexities of what monies are available and all of these other things, but we're not going to just put the projected cost right onto the property tax, but we will develop a plan over the next several months based on more information. The governor seems to be preparing to set up a situation where he effectively wants us to force substantial cuts into the education system because he believes that we spend too much money on our kids and believes that there is a way to limit that, either by taking money that is currently raised through the property tax for public education and using it for childcare or for other things, or some other variation, trying to, as he called for districts to revote their budgets to cut their costs, which is that's not at the statewide level, that's frankly not ours to ask, but he did. So we don't know exactly what that looks like, or where that might go in terms of the political dynamics of it, but I certainly would expect that over the next 3 or 4 weeks, that may start to become more obvious that there's an attempt by his administration to use this moment to shrink all of our government activities and our public education system. He's definitely doing it.
Usual end of session.
Yes,
End of
exactly.
session, conflict with the governor, everything's going along, there's sort of a lot of quiet, and then all of a sudden he's sort of,
That's right. And last year was the only year that we didn't have that with this governor, but we are seeing subtle signs that we may be headed for that future. So I just wanted to name that here, and we'll see. It may come back. Bob's question was, will the yield bill help with the Brattleboro situation, or how does it affect Brattleboro? And Emily, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So the yield bill will not have anything to do with the fact that Brattleboro's budget has not yet been voted, unfortunately. Brattleboro still needs to, along with the many other school districts, move forward with the vote that's being planned. Really encourage everyone to call and get an absentee ballot. The town clerk is quite ready and thrilled to send those out to people. And so people can vote for the school budget that way. Still sort of working on a resolution in the House, but it is much too late to really be particularly useful with that. And again, I am very sorry. Yes, the yield bill, and then more globally, yes, the yield bill will affect Brattleboro because it will be helping to set the tax rates for Brattleboro. My understanding of the calculation is that Brattleboro's individual tax rate, as sort of part of this whole conglomeration, because of our particular weights, will not be going up. But I have not seen the final numbers on that, because it's a lot of different levels of math.
Yep.
And the weights are very complicated and also related to whatever Brattleboro's budget is, individual town budget, and I'm not quite sure what that is yet, so we will see. But the impact on Brattleboro's budget of this particular yield bill was nominal when I last checked.
And so I'm going to go to Michael next, and then circle back to the comments that Spoon put in, and he has another question. So we'll come back to that, Spoon, after we get to Michael. Michael?
Yeah, actually, very quick question. First, I saw in the paper that Mollie's definitely running again. Maybe I didn't see whether I hope Tristan and Emily, you are too. Maybe you could just state whether you are or not. And my other question has to do with this new party that's looking at Marlboro College, whether Tristan, you think they're legitimate or bring something to the table, or you just don't know? Whatever.
So I'm happy to respond to that really quickly, the second question, but I'll also say that all three of us are running again. We have submitted our paperwork, and the filing deadline, the normal filing deadline for the primary has now passed. There are mechanisms if for parties that don't have a candidate to still caucus and nominate candidates for different races, but all three of us have filed for re-election. And as of the most up-to-date list, there are no other major party candidates in our districts who have chosen to run against us. That could change with party nomination processes. But so far, right now, all three of us have committed to running again. On the second question, I'm still an employee of Marlborough College, and so I want to be cautious. I'm learning as well as everybody else is, but I would say the upside of what I have seen from this entity is they are a real entity. They have substantial programs that are currently active. This particular idea is a stretch for them. Thank you, Millicent. Yeah, the question has to do with the nonprofit that has agreed to purchase the campus of Marlborough College and to run some new programming there. What they are looking to do is a new model of what some call like an early college experience, or somewhere in the associate's degree area, but be overlapping, allowing students to do that work starting in 11th grade. They run in some of their other work, they run a whole bunch of civic engagement programs, and in other places they run charter schools. And Mollie, I think, has a personal connection that she might speak to on this, but the upside is they are real. They've been around for a while. They're highly connected. They're very likely, substantially well funded. The risks, they are, we in Vermont are fairly skeptical of charter schools, as certainly the charter school movement nationally has been a challenge to public education in places. There are conflicting data points about how successful charter schools are if they have to actually deal with the level of complexity that public schools have to by law. And they're also in their descriptions very strongly on the sort of Edtech side of new models, and there are risks to that. Very few people have proven to be highly successful at disruptive technology-driven business models in higher education, if anyone yet, which isn't to say that they won't be successful. It's just they're entering new space. This is an experiment in trying something new that's driven by sort of a perception of the need to have college be more equitable and more integrated into internship-based experiences and civic engagement and support and cost. So it's an interesting idea, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, as far as this project goes, I don't know, but our son is a school principal of a middle school run by this Democracy Prep, which is a charter network that this spy, whose name now I'm forgetting, founded. And he actually before that worked in the Obama White House and is a very, very dynamic guy. He's a friend of ours who actually is also from Brattleboro, knows him fairly well. And he talked to him knowing that he was from here about Marlborough. I think the issue with the charter schools is that there are charter schools and there are charter schools. And the charter school that our son is involved with, the main thing about charter schools is that they siphon, usually the narrative is they siphon off the best students and then say, hey, see, we can do a better job without unionized teachers and things like that. this charter school is a charter school that takes the worst performing students of also a very disadvantaged population and of students who are learning disabled, and tries to bring them up to, you know, grade level, things like that. And it's actually a public charter school funded by the state of New York. I know we've had a lot of discussions in our family about this because our son was previously a public school teacher in Boston and very anti-charter and the way the charters were run in Boston. So I just want to add that thing. And he and his friend who also knows this person were very, very excited about this proposal. I think that the emphasis on low-income students and helping make a more equitable situation is a great, we'll have to see how it works out. And I think on the technology end, I just want to say that I think for the way that school has been working, this is just what I'm hearing from my grandchildren, they are really, really tired of being online as high school and elementary school students. I think it's different with, college students, especially people who have jobs. But, I think that a lot of people are saying, hey, we could just sort of do this all online. And the kids are really tired of it and miss the sort of social interaction that they get at school. But that's sort of a little bit of an aside. But I'm hopeful that this program and also our colleague Sarah Coffey was the co-chair of the committee that looked for a buyer for this. So I trust her judgment too, in terms of choosing the best fit for the community and the institution.
So we have a bunch of stuff coming. I want to just give a clarifying statement. I said Edtech, which is a jargony term, and I just wanted to explain what that meant. And then Emily, maybe you could navigate some of the questions that have come in and bringing them to the whole group. So Edtech is around the delivery of classroom experience, or how students are evaluated using technology, and particularly using sort of online technology or asynchronous learning, where you don't have to be in class together at the same time. And so it's using technology to mediate or define the educational experience in some way. And their model that they're proposing is a balance of in-person experience at the Marlboro campus with some version of online education. And so there's some interesting questions about what that means.
One, yes, I'm running again, Michael, and everyone else. Very, very excited to. We announced that last week as well. And if I could ever get out from underneath my constituent service work, which feels like it takes priority, I will draft an official statement to that effect and send it out. I'm hoping to finish that this weekend. And if folks would like to learn more about what's happening on Marlboro College campus, there's about 50 different Marlboro College Facebook groups, and the president of the charter school organization has joined all of those groups and is fielding some very difficult questions on all of those forums. And then we can also invite Sarah Coffey to come to one of these sessions to talk to people about this if you would like that. I will, if charter schools come to Vermont as a Vermont solution, or Edtech comes to Vermont as a Vermont solution, I will fight that with every fiber of my being. And I also don't want Marlboro College's campus to sit empty and all of those jobs to be lost. And so the world is a complicated place every day, and never more so complicated as since I've joined the legislature. Moving on to other topics. Ooh, there's so much action here. This is very exciting.
Yeah, and I haven't circled back. Spoon has thrown several different things into the chat thread. I haven't circled back to any of Spoon's thoughts. So
Spoon's first question was, has the legislature asked the governor to be specific about where there's overspending on education? I did actually ask Adam Gresham, who is the finance director and sort of carries a lot of water on these conversations for the governor. And he could not answer me directly. One of the governor's greatest skills is that he never answers a question directly. It's really it's fairly impressive in the, the dark world of things that can be impressive. So yes, and there was no answer. Scott Cooper asked if we have a word to say on the COVID compliant rally against police brutality on Main Street on Sunday afternoon. And then, are we aware? Do we support? Does Chief Fitzgerald and other first responders support groups having this rally on Main Street? So the Vermont State Police actually put out a very compelling statement standing in solidarity with the protesters and against police brutality. It's the only state police or police force that I know of that has issued a statement like that. Quite proud of that, and really some really incredible work that's happened with the Vermont State Police, who still have a long way to go, but are actively working on these issues. And I think Chief Fitzgerald has really always had a seat at the table and been trying to do that work as well. My understanding is that the rally that's planned is permitted. And so that would mean the explicit support of the police chief, because that's one of the places that a permitted rally has to go. And I will not be attending because I don't attend rallies on Sundays. That's just the only way I stay sane in this work. But I'm in full support that it's happening, and I'm really proud. I also hope that after the rally, people can step up to do other things as well, whether that's donating to legal defense funds or having difficult conversations or whatever else needs to happen to really have a more racially just community. Does anyone want to add anything, or should I keep on running through because we have a lot of questions? Okay, I'm running. David has much to say, our census representative has much to say about the census. Please, everyone, complete your census. If you have not completed the census, complete the census. It's incredibly important for Vermont to have adequate representation, to make good decisions with adequate data, and to get all the money that we want from the federal government, and we need that money. Vermont gets an enormous amount of federal money considering its size. And so we need those numbers to be able to do that. David Longsmith is available to help any resident with the completion of the census, and when the library reopens, library staff will also be available for that. You can contact him at 802-922-7240, and his email is david.a.longsmith@2020census.gov. There's a lot of information on the census website as well.
Emily, just make sure it's david.a.longsmith so
Thank
that
you.
the dots are crucial.
david.a.longsmith@2020census.gov. And then maybe the fabulous folks at BCTV could have that to be one of those cool scrolly things across the screen if they edit this. And then very interestingly, for the first time, second and seasonal homeowners are being asked to join the census. And so that's very exciting. And so folks should look into how to participate in that if they're second homeowners. More questions? There was another one from Scott that I lost somewhere.
I was asking about the mail ballot. I'll just take that one really quickly, which is that the initial challenge here was that the legislature, when we passed our first bill about mail-in voting, we gave the governor a role saying, the governor signs off on the plan of the Secretary of State. And then the governor was like, I'm not going to sign off until I get what I want, and I don't want to do this now. And we gave them some space to try to negotiate an agreement. We, legislative leaders were involved in communication saying, really wasn't our intent. You're overplaying your hand here. And the governor has basically said, well, I won't veto it if you send a revised change, some change to this law. But unless you do that, I'm not going to sign off on this plan until I feel ready. And so the Senate has initiated, Jeanette White, our senior senator from Windham County, has initiated a new bill to do just that, to return to what is the sort of natural constitutional authority of the Secretary of State. And the governor doesn't actually have a role in elections. It's Constitution empowers the legislature to sort of define all of the rules of voting, and for the Secretary of State to implement them. And so we're restoring normalcy there. The Secretary of State's intention is to have mailed in ballots be run by the Secretary of State, all the ordering to be done by the Secretary of State, and all of that to facilitate this working well. And there will always be public polling for people for equity of access. There'll be public polling locations, but the goal here is, I think, to move very quickly once the authorities are changed to move forward with this plan.
And for the both the school board budget vote and for the primary, people can still vote by mail. And the secretary, usually absentee ballots and vote by mail ballots come out of each town clerk's office, but the Secretary of State for the primary can mail out primary ballots to folks. And so that will ease that process as well. And people can do that on the Secretary of State's website. And so really taking the burden off of the individual town clerks to be doing this really intense vote by mail work and putting on the Secretary of State's office that has a lot more capacity to do that and can do it in a centralized way. Also want to make sure people understand that this is all being paid for with federal funds, COVID response funds, that will just be sent back if we don't spend them. We can't use them for other things. They are designed specifically around, accommodations around voting. That's what that funding is for. And so it would not be coming out of any state appropriations or state funds to do this.
There's a question about housing, and I haven't forgotten actually that Spoon had put in 2 sort of comment questions early that were accidentally to me privately, and I realized when I handed the baton back to Emilie to facilitate this section that she can't actually see those. So I will come back to that shortly. But on the housing, I didn't mention this explicitly, but there is a big chunk of housing related money and thinking in the governor's economic agenda. That work in the House is being divided. So the economic development parts of it are coming to the committee that I sit on. The housing portions are going to our General Military and Housing Committee, and they are working on the policy questions related to that particular bucket of money. And so, and they've done a ton of work this year and over the last few years on housing security, housing related questions. What I recall from the overview that I've seen, one of the bigger ideas is putting, I think, $8 million towards sort of helping to improve on the housing quality of 250 units of housing around the state through a grant process, which I think is important work, and it doesn't really address the structural dynamics of the number of people who we have who will be homeless when the current program ends, and the total number of units of housing that are substandard and the lack of available housing in key markets. So I'm not sure that the committee will agree with that particular allocation of resources. It's definitely complex. There is a physical shortage of housing. Spoon asked this question. There absolutely is a physical shortage of housing. There is a shortage of quality housing. There is a shortage of affordable housing. There's a shortage of workforce housing. And there's every other sort of traditional grouping. Depending on where you are in the state, there are different dynamics in different parts of the state. But it is extremely expensive to get affordable, clean, and safe housing, as Adam put into the chat. Huge wait lists, and we have a market failure in that our housing demand is much higher than the housing supply, and so that has put the cost at a very high level and the quality at a very low level, and yet we haven't been able to break out of it. It's particularly acute in Windham County and Chittenden County and other sort of economic centers around the state. Emilie or Mollie, do you want to speak to that?
Just want to add that the rehab work is really important in some other areas of the state and very useful in some other areas of the state. It's not very useful here, and will not get anywhere close to the problem. And I am concerned, and I think a lot of folks are concerned, that the rapid increase in the number of folks who are purchasing homes in Windham County at asking prices over the last month and likely into the future is going to continue to exacerbate a long-standing challenge. I think that the housing shortage can be considered both a market failure and a government failure. It's hard to keep, we don't actually have a free market, so any failures of the market is a failure of government to regulate said market. And
Agreed.
yeah, it's also a government failure that's very hard for a state to move out of on its own. It's a problem that's much more easily solved at the federal level, but we know that that is not possible right now.
And the reason I use the market failure language, and this is coming from a question from Spoon about it, but the reason I used the market failure language is that the cost of housing, the amount of capital required to make major changes into the number of housing units that are available is orders of magnitude bigger than what local governments are currently organized to spend. Now, I think there's a debate as to whether or not we could spend more. And I think we surely could, and we could enable better conditions, and we can make better choices about access. But government can't, at the moment, scale up to completely replace capital markets, and that's and the investment needed to get all the scale built out. And so that's where it's an intersection issue in a regulated market. It's an intersection issue between public financing and private financing. And private financing in the current market in Vermont is not meeting demand. And that's the definition of a market failure. It's not a moral statement one way or the other. It's just the technical definition of a market failure, where there's economic opportunity that isn't being addressed by the market for some reason. There's some dynamic at play, and that's an interesting problem for Vermont. In Chittenden County, where they've had 60,000 people added to the population over the last 4 decades, they've had obviously massive investments in new housing, both public and private. They still have a vacancy rate, a rental vacancy rate in the 1% to 2% range, which means that housing costs are extraordinarily high.
We are at 10:02. Spoon, I see your comment that it sounds like the state has come to depend on the feds for our housing. I don't think we have at all. We've had, I think that the Section 8 system and the work that organizations like Brattleboro Housing Partnership has done as part of the HUD system has been a really important component of this. But I think over the last, say, 20 years, it has become less and less a piece of the puzzle, and people have acknowledged that and adapted. I think our housing trust system with Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, which is has very little federal support, has been a really incredible piece of the puzzle in solving the problem. And we continue to invest in them in that, especially through our housing bond that happened last biennium. But there's still a lot more to do. And some of that can be done by regulation if we had the political will, and some of that needs to be done through dollars, which are much easier to create at the federal level than at the state level because of the nature of banking. But I think it's really, we need to look at all possible options. And I am significantly concerned about what's happening in Windham County and what's possible. And I think we were at a crisis point before, and now I think we are at a crisis and a crossroads, for whatever that's worth. Do we have any final questions? Next week, we are going to focus on opiates specifically. And we're going to sort of start out, we'll have our usual legislative updates about what sort of happened in the legislature the last week. And then we'll hear from some folks who are working in this world every day, as well as anyone else who's coming and living in that world every day, and really then try to spend most of the time talking about what political solutions might look like, and some community solutions might look like. And so really looking forward to that conversation. If people have suggestions for other topics we would like to focus on, it seems like housing might be one of them. Before we close up, does anyone else want to toss anything else into the mix? Oh, and also the Global Warming Solutions Act passed the Senate this week too, which means it finished its time in the House and moved over to the Senate. I don't know if it was second or third reading that passed this week, but third reading is often a fairly inconsequential thing. And so feeling really hopeful that that will get out of the building before we recess. So that's huge movement and wonderful. Topics for other weeks? Anyone?
The 16-year-old vote question was just thrown in by Spoon.
Spoon, do you ever look at the House calendar? So we finally got it out of committee successfully through some serious hustle on the part of the three of us. And it was going to be up for a vote on the floor, I think the day before we recessed.
Yeah.
And so now there's this whole swath of work that sits on the calendar that's sort of on the edge of controversial. There's a bill about decriminalizing possession of buprenorphine. There's our charter change around the youth vote. There's a few other things, and they just sort of sit there reminding us all about what was once possible and what is no longer possible. Because Tristan, why are things that were once possible no longer possible?
Yeah, thank you. I was going to speak to it anyway, so thank you to tee it up. And the reason why Emily threw that question to me is that this is the kind of question that the leadership team grapples with. And just to name a little bit more explicitly, the bill that is in question is that the town of Brattleboro passed a municipal change that would allow 16-year-olds to vote in municipal and school elections. And then the House committee recognized that the Act 46 issue had changed the dynamics of the school voting, stripped that out, but kept the municipal part in, and then voted it out of committee favorably. And as Emily said, all three of us on the House side have tried very hard to keep that moving forward. And the reason it's sitting right now is frankly that under House rules, we've had to suspend our normal rules in order to operate remotely in this COVID time, and to get an agreement on that, the House Rules Committee is made up of the majority party, minority party, and a few others, and to get an agreement out of that Rules Committee on what a virtual session would look like, we had to agree to really focus primarily on COVID. We did not give up. It was quite a battle, but we did not give up the right to do whatever we want to do out of committees and on the floor. But frankly, there's a dynamic here where our minority party, the Republican Party, has enough votes to prevent suspension of rules, but not enough votes to win most contentious issues in any way, unless they get substantial numbers of Democrats to join them. And so we have the ability to pass legislation, but we have a sort of a functional roadblock in the way. And so the agreements that we're living under are limiting all of the other bills in purgatory. I see the cannabis bill being named by Emily. That's definitely one. There's a really simple bill that would, over time, rename signs in our public parks to include their original Abenaki place names. Wouldn't cost any additional money because they would just be replaced as those signs are replaced. There's a bunch of different little pieces, some of which are pretty substantial policy issues. And so the basic pattern right now is everything we are doing is supposed to have a pretty clear nexus to the COVID response, and anything that isn't COVID related is by definition controversial. There was actually quite a bit of resistance to Brattleboro's move on the 16-year-old voting from Republican caucus members. So it is not a slam dunk for that caucus, and therefore their caucus leader would likely object to us bringing that up at this point. So we may yet get to it because there's going to be a summer session in August or September. We're going to have a summer recess after we pass the short-term budget, and then we're going to come back so that we can do our longer-term budget work with more information. And it may be that we attempt to move more legislation in that later period. But for now, by and large, you'll see that the work that we're doing has a clear nexus to COVID. And it's the power of the minority party to assert itself in the process.
It's also very challenging doing the voting online. It's very tedious. It's you're sitting in front of a screen. Voting takes a long time. It needs to be sort of a pared down process at this point.
And some days it seems like perhaps the minority party is making it more tedious so as to build the case for why we shouldn't be doing anything but the budget bill. I'm going to project a little bit here, but this is a political conversation, and I'm an elected liberal Democrat from a community that has so far been willing to vote for me to do that. And I will say that a number of these are things that we would likely have very few Republican votes in support of, and not necessarily the Brattleboro, although I think we would lose at least half their caucus, if not more, on the Brattleboro issue. And if they can successfully limit, our ability to take these issues up, they've won the vote because it doesn't pass. And so this is actually a place where it's about political power. The process becomes a piece of leverage to assert political power. And the backstop that they have is they have a governor who's a Republican and so can veto. And we don't have veto override capacity unless we can win some of the independents and some others. And so that allows them to assert some leverage, and the leverage is allowing them to limit some of the things that we are currently able to pass. They may change in August or September, but it isn't changing yet. And so I think it's always important to name when political power is the dynamic, because elections are about the choices that Vermonters make as to who has political power and who doesn't. And so if this particular agenda is an agenda that you want to see pass, and that certain people are opposed to it, that should inform your decision making. And we'll do our best to advocate for why we believe these ideas should pass, including Brattleboro's decision to support 16-year-olds voting in our local elections, which I think all of us are committed to, and recognize that political power is a dynamic that matters, and so elections matter. And hopefully we'll have a really clean process for mail-in voting, and we'll see massive increases in voter participation. And that would be super exciting for all of us. So I think we are well past 10, and we try to limit this to about an hour. And there's going to be more fruitful conversation on this and other issues. And so once again, I'll just offer my thanks to all of you for showing up and participating, and to the community watching this on BCTV. We're so grateful to live in this community and to have this level of engagement. These are
issues that are life and death, and super important to people's lives in our collective life and community with each other. And so we're grateful to have participation in helping us do our work well.
And regarding access, I think it was referenced a couple of times that you can tune in to any committee in real time or afterwards. Everything is on YouTube, much more accessible than it has been in the past, because in the past you would have to be in a committee room to hear this conversation. So you can go on the legislative webpage and sort of scan different committees, see when we're meeting on the floor, et cetera, and you can get a lot of information that way.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Please spread the word and invite friends, neighbors, whomever to come join that conversation. See you then.